Hi, I'm Simona. Me Too started on social media as a support tool for women who have experienced sexual assault. It was meant to empower them, let them be united. However, as the movement got popular, various suggestions to change the plots of well-known books and films have been argued for, showing that this movement might cause harm to the freedom of speech and sexual liberation. Are women actually that vulnerable that they need protection from the harms of the outside world? And are men just violent predators? Me Too is creating a culture of victims instead of letting people speak freely of their opinion. What is your take on that?
Simona, there's so much there for me to agree with. I think you're absolutely spot on in your analysis of what's going on with the Me Too movement. I think it does portray women as victims. I think it does portray men as predators in a way that just doesn't bear out in reality. Bad things happen, but in general, women are not victims, men are not predators. And I think you're absolutely right as well about where the logic of the Me Too movement begins to take us. And it does take us into highly censorious, very illiberal territory, and the idea that the plots of books and films should be altered is certainly something that's been raised by a number of people. And this is horrible, censorious, and again it's suggesting that there's a correct way for people to think and feel. So one of the arguments I have with a lot of people when I talk about consent classes at school and at university, one thing that people often come back and they say to me is, oh, but Joanna, you don't realise consent is sexy. And asking somebody if they consent in a relationship is sexy. My response to that is, well, how dare you tell me what is sexy and what is not sexy? I thought people were allowed to determine those things for themselves, and the books and plays and films that I like might have all kinds of things wrong with them according to this rule book of political correctness. I could laugh at all kinds of jokes that lots of people would consider offensive, but what I find funny or sexy is entirely down to me and my thoughts, and it shouldn't be controlled and restricted by what other people think. I don't think we should be dictated to in this way, and we shouldn't let the Me Too movement drive censorship in this way. And we need to be completely upfront, as you absolutely identify in your question, and point out that this is censorship.
Hi, I'm Dan. At the end of 2017, it was revealed that the Advertising Standards Authority will crack down on ads that feature stereotypical gender roles. The review suggested that new standards should consider whether stereotypical images reinforce assumptions that adversely limit how people see themselves and how others see them. Removing ads that rely on caricatures of certain activities as gender-specific seems to me to be a progressive move. Will the regulation of advertising standards help or hinder female empowerment?
Thanks, Dan. That's a really good question. So, will women's lives be better today if advertising shows them in more empowered positions in society? Is the position of women at a disadvantage today because we all watched the Oxo mum on television when we were young, serving dinner to her family and pouring out the gravy? Actually, I think not. I think we can watch adverts on the telly showing all kinds of silly things, and the idea that women will watch an advert, or children, girls growing up, will watch adverts and see women picking up socks off the floor, tidying up the house, pouring out the gravy, and come to the conclusion that that's their role in life. It's just patronising and insulting to think that women are so stupid they feel the need to act out what they see in adverts. So no, I don't think we need any more regulation of advertising. I think the reality of women's lives today is that they're doing better than ever before in the world of work and at school, in education, in all aspects of life. So the idea that they're being held back by some stereotypical cliches in adverts is just laughable.
Hi, my name is Samantha. You have criticized the media for prioritizing celebrities who speak up as victims of sexual harassment, as that seems to be a minor problem compared to scandals that are happening in places like Telford amongst working-class women and girls. Is there a way to help working-class women spread the news so that their voices are heard, as in the Telford case?
So Samantha, I think you're absolutely right. That is something that I've said, that I think one of the problems with the Me Too movement is that it puts a lot of focus on comparatively trivial issues suffered by middle-class women at the expense of ignoring some of the more serious problems faced by perhaps more working-class women. But I think what's very interesting in your question is when you ask what can we do to help almost give voice to the experiences of these working class women. And I think that's kind of very revealing, because to me, it's not so much that we need working class women to be able to have a more powerful voice in the media. What we need is them to actually be able to solve the problems that they're facing. If they're experiencing abuse, like the girls in Telford, we need that abuse to stop. And I think one of the problems with the Me Too campaign is it makes it seem as if the only way to stop a problem is by tweeting about it, by getting a profile on social media, by getting national coverage in newspapers. Actually, what these girls in Telford needed was for the police, social workers, teachers to take them far more seriously when they were talking about the issues and the problems that they were experiencing. And for me, that's not about sitting down and sending tweets or having a Guardian column. That's much more about working on the ground, about these young women being empowered themselves, feeling strong enough to insist that people listen to them, and for social workers and teachers to actually start taking their problems seriously.
Hi, I'm Anastasia. I have read articles about Oxford University wanting to feminize its curriculum by requesting the inclusion of women on reading lists. As an academic yourself, I would like to hear your opinion on this. Is it necessary to include more women in university curriculums, or is it part of a new culture of censorship and conformity? I also want to ask, is it essential to have women on the reading list when teaching feminist theory? And how important is it to have a diverse and intersectional reading list?
We've all heard by now that Oxford University are planning to have a rule, or certainly a recommendation, that their philosophy degrees should contain 40% of readings by women. And what's more, that the first names of authors on reading lists should be included too, just to make it absolutely clear which people on the reading list are women. So people like W.E.B. Du Bois or C.L.R. James would no longer have the privilege of being just their initials. They would have to have their whole names out in full. Now, there were women philosophers in the past who went by their initials, and I think the reason why they did that was very, very important. They wanted to be known as a philosopher first and a woman second. And my big concern with this whole project of specifying a certain number of women who should be included, stressing that first names should be included as well as surnames, is that it really asks us to judge these people as women first and philosophers second. And to me, that seems like a really backward and regressive step. I think academics should and do keep their reading lists under review. But I think what's important is that you should be adding content to your reading lists, you should be changing the curriculum, depending upon what's intellectually exciting, interesting and worthwhile to study. And that shouldn't be based upon either gender or skin colour. That should be based upon who's written interesting things that you want your students to engage with. Actually, if you're studying something like literature or feminist theory, you'll find there's loads of work by women. I think it would be impossible to study a degree on feminist theory without reading stuff that's been written by women. I'd really struggle to find some good books on feminist theory that have been written by men. So I think we've got to be careful about overreacting and panicking a little bit here. But yeah, I'm all for women being included on reading lists, definitely, but they need to be there because of merit. And when we put women on reading lists because of merit, I'm sure we'll find that there's lots of them.
Hi, I'm Caroline. In Parliament in March 2018, a Labour Party MP named Melanie Onn called for catcalling to be considered a hate crime. While many think that this would be a step too far, 71% of women in the UK do report that they have adapted their behaviour in order to protect themselves from the threat of harassment, including changing their routes to work and avoiding parks. Do you think that Melanie Onn's idea is too extreme? If so, what are other ways we can make these 71% of UK women feel safer?
So thanks for that, Caroline. This is something I've been thinking about an awful lot recently, this issue of street catcalling and harassment. And you're right, Melanie On and other Labour MPs have flagged this up as something which needs to be taken more seriously, have it labelled as a misogynistic hate crime and allow the police to deal with it that way. They come out with these statistics like 71% of women have changed their behaviour, 90% of women have experienced street harassment at some point in their lives. I'm always slightly dubious about these statistics. There was another survey that came out not that long ago which suggested that among women aged 18 to 24, winking and whistling are experienced as forms of sexual harassment. And I think for me, when we see that sexual harassment's being defined so broadly, it always makes me wonder actually, well, why so few was only 71%, why so few was 90% of women? It does really bother me, and it does actually upset me a lot to hear that 71% of women have changed their behaviour. But what concerns me is that these women are not changing their behaviour necessarily in response to anything that's actually happened to them, but more in response to fear. That something potentially might happen to them, or that if they get whistled at in the street, this is an experience they should interpret as traumatic, that they need to go and kind of lie down. The statistics scare women a lot more than the reality of anything bad happening to them is warranted, and I think it's tragic that it's feminists that are putting the fear into women nowadays rather than patriarchal fathers, which it might have been 100 years ago.
In politics today, disagreement is being redefined as bullying, especially when it comes to female politicians. In the Labour Party, the Haringey council leader resigned, claiming she was the victim of bullying by Momentum members. When the MP, Seema Malhotra, resigned the front bench in protest at Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, she also said she'd been bullied. And recently, after Debbie Abrahams was forced to step aside after allegations of bullying, she then hit back, accusing others of bullying her. All of these cases essentially boiled down to disagreements between the more Corbynite and Blairite factions of the party. What does it mean for women if political disagreements are framed in this way? And is free speech in danger if the B word can be so easily weaponised?
Thanks, Fraser. This is a great question. Bullying is a word that we see bandied around so often nowadays. Certainly when I was growing up, it was a word that was used exclusively for children in schools. But nowadays we hear about bullying in all walks of life with people of all ages. And one of the things that I think is hugely troubling about feminism today is that it has this very infantilizing impact upon women. It really treats women like children, and it does that in the sense of asking for all kinds of protections for women, that women need special treatment, they need to be looked after in a way that feminists of a previous era really reacted against. If we're going to, in Parliament, describe people who disagree with us as bullying, or people who maybe get a bit heated in their conversations, do shout, maybe swear as bullying, then what these women MPs are saying is that we're children and we want the regulations and the restrictions that are introduced into schools to apply in Parliament as well. And we've even heard of calls now for MPs in Parliament to have consent classes like schools and universities, and essentially they're saying we're children and we want the same rules and restrictions that we had in school applied in the workplace. And to me, this is just really demeans women. It does women no favours whatsoever. It's really pathetic, and it makes me cringe when I hear adult women saying that they're being bullied in this way.
Hi, I'm Giacomo. Misogyny can be defined as an attitude of hate and contempt for women, which suggests that misogynistic acts could be treated as an instance of hate crime. However, many commentators have argued that catcalling and similar acts, despite being unacceptable, should not be criminalized, because this would be a waste of time and money. Do you think that education could be a better instrument to condemn these behaviors and minimizing their occurrence?
Giacomo, you're suggesting that education might be a useful way of teaching men not to catcall and harass women on the street. And this is certainly an argument that I've heard before, and it's an argument that's often put by people who are a bit more progressive, a bit more liberal, don't want to see new laws being introduced and don't want to see new regulations introduced into society. So that's really great, and that's something I would agree with. But the suggestion is, well, perhaps we need to just educate people instead and bring about a shift in the culture. In some ways, I actually think that's a bit more dangerous even than introducing new laws, which I'm certainly no fan of doing whatsoever. I think, for one thing, we need to ask what problem is it that we're responding to here. I think catcalling, for me, just isn't really a problem. The cliche is the builder leering and leching at women on the street, but companies have very strict policies preventing that. But actually, surveys of men have shown that more men now think that this is inappropriate behaviour and it's not considered to be something socially acceptable anymore. So attitudes are clearly shifting. Whether we need education to help and go even further in that line, I think no. For one thing, you alter the course of education away from teaching knowledge of the world about books and literature and maths and science to teaching people what values they should have. We introduce this project where we teach people in schools how to relate to each other, how to think about particular issues, and we suggest that there is a correct way of thinking, a correct way of behaving, a correct set of values to hold, and I think that's very problematic. I mean, who sets down what these correct values are? And I think the idea that we use schools as, in a way, a kind of social engineering the values we want to see in the next generation is an inherently risky and problematic strategy, and it's an abuse of education as far as I would see it. But whereas a law or a regulation is something I would completely disagree with, it's something that we could perhaps have a campaign against, we could challenge a law. But when you start using education, essentially you're getting into controlling people's thoughts, telling people there's a correct way to think. I don't think that's the role of schools at all.
Hello, I'm Casper. I believe the Carl Sargent case, the Welsh Labour politician who killed himself at the end of 2017 following undisclosed allegations of incidents with women, represents a growing trend of social justice warrior-motivated cyberbullying. Men and women both are finding themselves in the firing line. If internet regulation is not the way to go, what can we do to support people?
Thanks, Casper. That's a really interesting question. And online abuse is a problem that we're hearing more and more about nowadays. And suddenly I've received one or two nasty tweets in my time, but I try not to let it get to me. I would be against more attempts to regulate the internet to rule out abuse online. And I think the main reason why I would be against attempts to regulate the internet in that way is because abuse is so subjective. And I know there's a very, very fine line between criticism and abuse. And I think when you start looking to regulate something that is experienced so subjectively, the danger is that there's no obvious place where to stop. The danger is you could just regulate the entire internet because everybody's going to be offended by something somewhere. But recognising that this is a problem, I think, to some extent, and particularly on Twitter, I think it's a forum where people are sending things very quickly in the heat of the moment and often behind a cloak of anonymity. So it does give people licence to say things that they might not say face to face when they're dealing with people in public. But I don't think the answer is regulation. I don't think the answer is restricting what people can say on Twitter. But I do think perhaps sometimes it's more of a case just for defending other people on Twitter, sticking up for people. Actually, I really like the mute button, and there's the block button as well if somebody really gets on your nerves, so you can mute people, block people. You don't have to listen to people. That's the great thing about it. And if you see somebody being attacked and you want to defend them, then you should go for it, and we should be sticking up for each other a bit more on social media, regulate the community ourselves rather than calling in Facebook, Twitter authorities to do that for us.